The morning I got married, my grandmother pressed both of her hands against my face and held it the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. And she looked at me with those dark, steady eyes that had seen 79 years of this world. And she said, "Baby, whatever happens today, remember that God never wastes a moment. Not one." I laughed. Because it was my wedding morning, and the sun was coming through the window of the church bridal suite in long gold columns, and my bridesmaids were laughing about something in the corner, and the flowers smelled like the specific hope of a woman who has waited for something and believes it has finally arrived. I laughed because my grandmother had a way of saying serious things at tender moments, and I assumed she was simply being Grandma Opal, profound, a little heavy, always operating on a frequency slightly deeper than the room. I did not know she was prophesying. My name is Simone Adele Whitfield. I am 41 years old. I am the daughter of a woman who taught elementary school for 31 years, and a man who drove trucks for a living and sang bass in the church choir every Sunday without fail, who together raised me in a household where faith was not a Sunday decoration, but the actual infrastructure of daily life, the thing that held the ceiling up and kept the floor from giving way. I grew up in Greater Covenant Pentecostal Church in Memphis, Tennessee, where the worship was long and loud and unafraid of the Holy Spirit, and where I learned early that the presence of God in a room was not a metaphor, but a physical reality that you could feel in your sternum when the choir hit the right chord. I moved to Atlanta at 27 for a master's degree in social work and never moved back. I found a church home at Bright Morning Star Baptist Church, a congregation of about 400 families on the west side of the city, led by a pastor named Reverend Calvin Green, who preached with the disciplined fire of a man who had been in the Word long enough to have opinions about it. I joined the women's ministry, then the hospitality team, then the counseling support circle that worked alongside the pastoral care team. I built a life there. I built a community. I built the kind of roots that a transplant grows when she decides a city is going to be home. And 8 years after I arrived, I met Marcus Elliott Vaughn. I want to tell you about Marcus the way I knew him before I knew everything, because this story requires that you understand what I believed I had before I tell you what I actually had. Marcus was 41 years old when we met, tall, deliberate, with the particular quiet confidence of a man who did not need a room to notice him, but always got noticed anyway. He had been at Bright Morning Star for 6 years. He served on the deacon board, taught the men's Bible study on Thursday evenings, and had a reputation in the congregation for integrity so consistent that Pastor Green used him as an example from the pulpit more than once. He was not flashy. He was not performing. He was simply, reliably, visibly present in the ways that matter in a church community. At the hospital when someone was sick, at the house when someone needed a hand, at the meeting when a decision needed to be made correctly. I noticed him the way you notice things that are genuine when you have spent enough time around things that are not. We were introduced by Sister Marilyn from the hospitality team, who had been orchestrating what I later understood was an intentional campaign to put us in the same room at the same time until one of us said something. We had been attending the same church for 3 years before we actually spoke. The particular absurdity of a large congregation where proximity and relationship are not the same thing. The conversation we had that first time lasted 2 hours at a church fellowship lunch, and when I drove home afterward, I sat in my car in my own driveway for 15 minutes because I could not remember the last time a conversation had felt that effortless. We dated for 2 years. We were engaged for 14 months. We were the couple that people at Bright Morning Star said things about, warm things, the things people say when they genuinely believe two people belong together. Pastor Green told Marcus in private, and Marcus told me with an expression that was equal parts humble and moved, that he believed our relationship was a demonstration of what God-ordered partnership looked like. I believed it. I had no reason not to. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in June. The church sanctuary had been reserved for a year. My dress had been chosen, fitted, altered, and hung in a garment bag in my mother's closet since February because I did not trust myself not to look at it every day if it was in my own house. The flowers were white peonies and deep green eucalyptus. The colors were ivory and sage. The reception would be in the fellowship hall, which Sister Marilyn and the hospitality team had offered to coordinate as a gift to me, which made me cry in a way that only women who have built genuine community understand. 412 guests had confirmed attendance. The morning of my wedding, I was 38 years old, and I believed, completely, without reservation, that I was standing at the beginning of the best chapter of my life. I was standing at the beginning of a chapter. That part was true. It was not the chapter I thought it was. I need to tell you about the months before the wedding, because the signs were there and I missed them. And I want to tell you about missing them without performing shame about it, because the missing of signs is not stupidity. It is trust, and trust is not a character flaw. Trust is what you build with someone who has given you consistent reason to extend it. And Marcus had given me consistent reason, and the signs I missed were small enough and infrequent enough that any reasonable woman in my position would have missed them too. The first thing I noticed but did not name was that Marcus had started spending more time at the church on weekday evenings than his deacon board schedule required. He explained it as preparation for the men's Bible study expansion he was planning, a new format that would require more curriculum development. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the kind of thing Marcus did, thorough, invested, going further than required. I accepted it without examination. The second thing was a change in how he handled his phone. Not dramatic. He did not start hiding it under pillows or taking it into the bathroom. It was subtler than that. He started placing it face down on surfaces when he set it down, where before he had always placed it face up. A small habit change. The kind of thing you notice subconsciously and file away without deciding to file it, until later when you are going through everything looking for the architecture of what happened. The third thing was a woman I did not know named Tanya, who appeared at a church event about 4 months before the wedding and who Marcus introduced to me as someone from the Thursday evening Bible study group. She was 32, bright, attractive in the particular way of a woman who was aware of it without being aggressive about it. She shook my hand and said she had heard so much about me and was so excited for the wedding. I thanked her. I noticed that Marcus's expression when she spoke to me was slightly more composed than usual. Not guilty, just managed. A fraction of a degree of extra management that I registered somewhere in the back of my mind and did not retrieve until later. That is all I had. 3 small things across 14 months. I want to be honest about how small they were because I have spent time since wondering if I should have seen more. And the honest answer is, perhaps. But I was not in the practice of investigating the man I was about to marry. I was in the practice of building a life with him. And those two practices do not coexist easily. The week before the wedding, I had a dream. I do not usually pay close attention to dreams. I am a practical woman by training and by temperament, a social worker who deals in the concrete rather than the symbolic. But this dream was different in the specific quality that certain dreams have when they are more than processing. I was standing at the altar of Bright Morning Star in my wedding dress, and the church was full and the organ was playing, and when I turned to see Marcus coming down the aisle toward me, I saw that he was not alone. He was walking beside a woman in white, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. Her dress was simple. Her face was turned toward me. She was not threatening in the dream. She was simply there, beside him, present in the space where only I was supposed to be. I woke up and I prayed, and I told myself it was pre-wedding anxiety given symbolic form. And I went back to sleep, and I did not tell anyone about it. I should have told Grandma Opal, the morning of the wedding. I want to slow down here and take you into that bridal suite with me, because the details of that morning are the details of a woman at her most open, most hopeful, most beautifully vulnerable, most fully invested in a vision of her own future. And the contrast between that openness and what was about to happen is the whole point of this story. The bridal suite at Bright Morning Star was a converted room off the church's east corridor, a sitting room with a full-length mirror, 2 armchairs, a love seat, and a vanity with good lighting that the hospitality team had stocked with tissues, Bobby pins, safety pins, a sewing kit, breath mints, and a small arrangement of white peonies that matched my bouquet. Sister Marilyn had thought of everything. That was who she was. My mother was there. My sister Vanessa, who was my maid of honor and who had flown in from Memphis 2 days earlier and had already cried 4 times over things that did not require crying. My 2 bridesmaids, Cora and Josephine, who had been my closest friends since graduate school and who were handling the morning with the particular organized chaos of women who love you enough to show up at 7 a.m. and mean it. And Grandma Opal, who sat in one of the armchairs in her silver dress with her white gloves in her lap and her hat tilted just so, watching everything with the calm attention of a woman who had attended enough significant moments in her life to know how to be present without being in the way. My dress was everything. I say that not with vanity, but with the particular emotion of a woman who had not worn anything white and formal since she was a flower girl at 6 years old, who had reached 38 without a wedding, who had spent enough years alone to have made peace with the possibility of more years alone, and who now stood in a mirror and saw herself in ivory silk and lace and felt the specific grace of something that had not been rushed. It fit me. Not just in measurement, in meaning. The photographer came in at 8:30 for detail shots, the dress on the hanger, the shoes, the bouquet, my grandmother's hands on my face. That is when she said it. Both hands pressed against my cheeks, those clear, dark eyes, and, "Baby, whatever happens today, remember that God never wastes a moment. Not one." I laughed. The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock. By 10:15, the sanctuary was filling. I knew this because Vanessa kept slipping out to check and returning with reports delivered in the slightly breathless tone of a woman who found the whole thing more exciting than the bride did, which made me love her completely. 400 people. The choir in their robes. The flowers on every pew end. The unity candle on the table near the altar. Pastor Green in his best suit behind the pulpit, reviewing his notes. Marcus was somewhere in the building, in the groom's suite with his groomsmen, getting ready. We had followed the tradition of not seeing each other the morning of the wedding. I had honored that tradition fully, which meant the last time I saw Marcus was Friday evening at the rehearsal dinner, where he had stood up and given a toast that made my mother cry and made Grandma Opal nod slowly with the expression of someone grading a performance and finding it acceptable. At 10:40, Sister Marilyn came to the bridal suite to do a final walkthrough. She checked the flowers, checked my veil, confirmed the processional order with Vanessa. She was composed and professional and warm, the way she always was. But when she came close to fix the edge of my veil, I saw something cross her face, brief, controlled, gone in a second, that I could not name. I should have named it. She said, "Everything is beautiful, Simone. You are beautiful." She said it with slightly more weight than the occasion required, and then she left. At 5 minutes to 11, Vanessa lined us up in the corridor outside the sanctuary doors. She handed me my bouquet. She straightened my veil one final time. She took my arm and looked at me with the full-face emotion of an older sister who has watched her younger sister wait for something and is watching it arrive. "Ready?" she asked. I said, "So ready." The doors opened. The organ began. And I took my first step into the sanctuary toward the life I believed I was beginning. I want to tell you what I saw when those doors opened, because I want you to understand that for the first 45 seconds, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. 400 faces turned toward me, earned. The sanctuary was full in the warm, luminous way that a church full of people who love you is full. Not just occupied, but inhabited, alive with the specific energy of community, gathered for something they believe in. The choir hummed softly. The flowers were perfect. The candles on the altar caught the morning light coming through the stained glass windows and threw small, colored shadows across the carpet. Pastor Green stood at the front with the settled authority of a man who had married many couples and was about to marry one more. And Marcus stood at the altar. He was in his dark suit, the one he had shown me weeks earlier, ivory pocket square, his groomsmen flanking him on each side. He was looking toward the doors, toward me, with an expression that I read in those first seconds as the expression of a man receiving something he had waited for. His eyes were bright. His jaw was set in that particular way of his, that particular composure. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm. I felt the eyes of 400 people, and I felt my father's arm steady under my hand, and I felt the specific solemnity of a woman who is walking toward a covenant she intends to keep. I was about 3/4 of the way down the aisle when I heard it. Not a sound, more like a shift in the room's atmosphere. The specific change in air pressure that a room full of people undergoes when something unexpected has entered it. A ripple of turned heads. Not turned toward me. Turned toward the back of the sanctuary, toward the side doors. I did not stop walking. My father's arm kept me moving forward, but I turned my head, the way you turn your head when your body knows before your mind does that something requires your attention. A woman was entering through the side door on the right of the sanctuary. She was wearing white, not cream, not champagne, not the peripheral white of a woman who didn't think about the rule. White. A white dress, formal, floor-length, fitted, with a neckline and silhouette that were unmistakably intentional. Her hair was done. Her shoes were white. She carried nothing in her hands, no purse, no program. She was not a guest who had slipped in late. She was a statement. And she walked to a seat in the 4th pew on the right side of the sanctuary, and she sat down and she looked at the altar. The room was doing what rooms do when something wrong has entered. Absorbing it, processing it, whispering about it at the edges while the center tried to hold the original event together. I heard the specific sound of 400 people trying to decide whether to react. I kept walking. I reached the front. My father placed my hand in Marcus's. He stepped back. Pastor Green smiled at the congregation and said, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the presence of God." And I was standing at the altar of my own wedding, looking at the man I intended to marry, with a woman in white sitting 4 pews back on the right side of the sanctuary. And something in my chest, something below thought, below language, below the 18 months of plans and flowers and ivory silk, said, "You know who that is." I did not know her name yet, but I knew. I knew the way women know things that their lives have been trying to protect them from knowing. Pastor Green was speaking. I heard his voice the way you hear a sound through water, present but muffled by the thickness of what I was trying to process. Marcus's hands were on mine. His hands were warm. His expression was still composed in that particular way of his, that specific management I had catalogued and not examined. He was not looking at the woman in white. He was looking at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had not seen before, or perhaps something I had seen and named incorrectly. I had called it composure. I had called it steadiness. I was now understanding, in the particular clarity that arrives in the worst moments, that what I had called composure was the specific expression of a man managing 2 realities at the same time. I said, quietly, so that only he could hear, "Marcus, who is she?" His hands tightened slightly on mine. He said, "Simone," I said, still quietly, still with my voice controlled by some grace I did not know I possessed. "Tell me the truth right now." He closed his eyes for 1 second, and that 1 second was the answer. I turned to Pastor Green. I said, "Pastor, I need 1 moment." Pastor Green had been in ministry for 32 years. He had the particular wisdom of a man who has seen enough to know when to let a moment breathe. He stepped back slightly and said to the congregation, "Let us take a moment in prayer." He bowed his head. 400 people bowed their heads, and I turned and walked the 4 pews back on the right side of the sanctuary, and I stood in front of the woman in white. She looked up at me. She was 32 years old. She was Tanya, the woman from the Bible study group. The woman who had shaken my hand 4 months ago and said she had heard so much about me. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I want you to stand up, and I want you to leave this building. not because I am afraid of you. Because this is the house of God, and what you came here to do is beneath both of us, and I will not let this sanctuary hold this." She looked at me. Something moved in her expression. Not remorse, not exactly, but the specific discomfort of a person whose plan has encountered a response it did not expect. She stood. She walked to the side door she had come in through. And she left. I turned back toward the altar. 400 people were still in prayer, or pretending to be. My father was standing at the front of the sanctuary with an expression I had never seen on his face before, and never want to see again. My sister Vanessa had one hand pressed flat against her mouth. Sister Marilyn, standing near the side of the sanctuary, had tears on her face and her chin lifted in an expression that I understood was pride and grief at the same time. I walked back to the altar. I stood in front of Marcus. I said, "Is there more I need to know right now? Before I make any decision in front of God and these people, is there more I need to know?" He said, "Simone, please." I said, "That is not what I asked." He exhaled. He said, "Yes." I stood very still. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me the truth. I needed the truth more than I needed the wedding." I turned to Pastor Green. I said, "Pastor, I'm asking you to dismiss the congregation. There will not be a ceremony today." Pastor Green looked at me with the eyes of a man who is doing the most difficult thing his calling has ever asked of him, which was to honor a woman's dignity in the hardest moment of her life. He nodded once. He turned to the congregation. He said, "Church, we are going to ask you to give the Whitfield and Vaughn families some space. Please exit quietly and know that you are loved and this family is covered in prayer." 400 people began, slowly, and in the particular stunned silence of a community that has just witnessed something it will be talking about for years, to file out of the sanctuary of Bright Morning Star Baptist Church. I stood at the altar in my wedding dress with my bouquet in my hands, and I watched them go. And I did not cry. Not because I was not broken, I was. But I had used every piece of composure I owned to walk those 4 pews and say what needed to be said and make the decision that needed to be made. And what was left after that expenditure was not tears. What was left was a very still, very clear, very cold knowing. The knowing that I had just saved my own life in the hardest way possible, and that the saving of it was going to require everything I had left. Lord, I am standing in the ruins of something I built with my whole heart. The flowers are still on the pews, my dress is still on my body, the food is still in the kitchen. And the life I thought I was beginning is not the life I am in. I do not know what you are doing. I do not know why you let me walk this far, but I remember that you do not waste moments, not one. So I am asking you to stay in this one with me, because I cannot carry it alone. I am going to skip forward now, past the immediate hours that followed, because some things belong only to the people who lived them. I will tell you that my mother held me in the bridal suite for a long time. I will tell you that Grandma Opal sat in the armchair and did not say, "I told you so," because she is not that kind of woman. She simply held my hand and said, "Breathe," at regular intervals until my breathing normalized. I will tell you that Vanessa, who is the one in our family who converts pain into logistics, had already called the reception venue and was working her way through the list of people who needed to be notified, and that the steadiness with which she did it was one of the more remarkable things I have ever witnessed. I will tell you that Marcus tried to come to the bridal suite, and that my father, who had not yet spoken a word since the ceremony ended, stood in the doorway and said 2 sentences in a voice I had never heard him use before. Marcus did not come in. I will tell you that I stayed in that bridal suite for almost 2 hours, and that when I finally walked out of it, I had taken off my veil and my shoes, and I was carrying my bouquet loosely at my side. And I walked through the church corridor, and through the front door, and into the June afternoon sunlight, and I stood on the front steps of Bright Morning Star Baptist Church, and I breathed in outside air for the first time in what felt like years. And I will tell you that Pastor Green was waiting on those steps. He had dismissed the congregation and handled what needed to be handled inside, and he was simply there, on the steps, in his good suit, waiting in case I needed him. He did not say much. He said, "Simone, you did something today that took more courage than most people ever have to find. I want you to know that this church, this community, is not going anywhere. We are here. We are yours." I thanked him, and I meant it. Though I did not know yet, standing on those steps in my wedding dress, what "this church is here" was going to look like in the months ahead. I did not know how badly I would need it. I did not know what it was going to be asked to hold. I only knew that the day I thought would be the beginning of one story had become the beginning of a different one, and that I was still standing. That had to be enough for now. The weeks after the wedding that did not happen were the kind of weeks that test the interior architecture of a person, the structural integrity of the faith and community and self-knowledge that you have built over a lifetime, put under a pressure you did not choose and cannot fully understand and must find a way to bear. I will tell you what that looked like practically, because I think the practical matters as much as the spiritual, and I have never believed in separating them. The Monday after the wedding, I called in to work. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I run a small practice. 2 years prior, I had left a nonprofit to open my own office, a decision that had required more faith than I had sometimes felt I possessed. I called my office manager, a woman named Denise, who had worked with me for 4 years, and who received the news of what had happened with the professional composure and personal devastation that people feel when they care about you. And the situation is genuinely terrible. I took 2 weeks of personal leave. I needed time to be a person before I could ask myself to be a professional. The first thing I did in those 2 weeks, after the immediate emergency of family and survival, was sit down with the financial reality. This is the part of the story that I think is least often told and most necessary to tell, because when a relationship ends, particularly a serious, long-term, engaged relationship, the financial entanglement can be as devastating as the emotional one, and I had been building a life with Marcus that had financial dimensions that required immediate attention. We had been engaged. We had not yet merged our finances. I had insisted on maintaining separate accounts through the engagement, a decision I had made not from distrust, but from the professional advice of a financial planner I trusted, who said that financial merging before marriage was premature, regardless of how certain you felt. That decision, which Marcus had accepted without complaint, now looked like the specific providence of a God who sees further than we do. My accounts were mine. My practice was mine. My apartment lease was in my name alone. But there were joint deposits made for the wedding, the reception venue, the caterer, the photographer. There was furniture we had purchased together for the house we had planned to move into after the honeymoon, which was now sitting in a storage unit with both our names on the rental agreement. There was a trip that had been booked for a honeymoon that was not going to happen. I made a list. I went through it line by line. I called vendors. I negotiated refunds where possible and accepted losses where necessary. The losses were not small, but they were survivable, which was a word I was using a lot in those early weeks as a kind of standard. Not fine, not okay, not healed, but survivable. I can survive this. And I moved through each thing on the list, and I survived each one, and I crossed it off, and I moved to the next. My therapist during that period was a woman named Dr. Kezia Brandt, a black woman in her late 50s who had been my therapist for 3 years before the wedding and who I called the Monday morning after, before I called anyone else, because I knew that the thing I was carrying was going to require professional containment alongside the spiritual and relational support that my community could provide. She had a cancellation slot on Tuesday. I took it. Dr. Brandt did not let me perform okay. That was the most important thing she did. She had known me long enough to recognize the particular way I used competence as a shield against feeling, and she dismantled that shield efficiently and without apology in the first session, which made me furious and then grateful and then, finally, a week later, capable of actually grieving. Because I had to grieve. I want to tell you that plainly, because I think there is a temptation in stories like this one to move too quickly to the triumph, and to suggest that the strength of a woman's response to betrayal means she did not feel it. I felt it. I felt it in the specific, compounded way that a woman feels the loss of a person and the loss of a vision of her future, and the loss of trust she had extended carefully and deliberately and had every reason to believe was warranted. I felt it at 2 o'clock in the morning, and in the shower, and while sitting in church, and while eating dinner alone, and in the 100 small, ordinary moments of a day where you reach for the life you thought you had and find the space where it used to be. I cried. I was angry. I was humiliated by the memory of standing at that altar in front of 400 people with a woman in white, sitting 4 pews back and everyone seeing it before I did. I was angry at myself for missing the signs I had partially seen. I was angry at Tanya, not with the wild anger of someone who blames the other woman for the choices of the man, but with the cold anger of a woman who recognizes that what Tanya came to that church to do was deliberately cruel, and cruelty deserves acknowledgement. And I was angry at Marcus with the specific grief anger of someone who had trusted fully and been deceived, which is not rage so much as a kind of profound sorrow that keeps finding new rooms in you. I was all of those things, and I kept going anyway. Not because I was exceptionally strong, because going was the only direction available. Pastor Green called me 3 weeks after the wedding. He asked if I would come in for a conversation when I was ready. I went the following Tuesday. I want to tell you about that conversation because it represents something I have come to believe is essential to surviving betrayal in a faith community. The difference between a church that protects its image and a church that protects its people. I had been afraid, in those first weeks, that Bright Morning Star would manage the situation in the way that institutions sometimes manage uncomfortable truths, quietly, with language designed to preserve the general peace rather than acknowledge the specific wrong. I had seen this happen in other congregations. I had worked with women in my practice who had experienced exactly that management, the slow erasure of their experience in the service of institutional reputation. That is not what happened at Bright Morning Star. Pastor Green sat across from me in his office, and he said, "Simone, I want to know how you are, not how you are presenting, not how you are managing, how you actually are." I told him honestly. I told him about the anger and the grief and the humiliation and the 2 a.m. moments and the insurance of having kept separate finances and the therapy and the list I was working through. I told him all of it in the straightforward way that I tell things to people I trust, and he received it without flinching and without spiritualizing it into a shape that was more comfortable. Then he said, "I have had a direct conversation with Marcus. He is no longer serving on the deacon board, and he has been placed on a formal accountability and restoration process. That process is between him and the church leadership, and I will not share its details with you because they are not yours to carry. But I want you to know that what happened was not treated as a private matter between 2 individuals. It was treated as a matter of character and accountability, and the church acted accordingly." I said, "And Tanya?" He said, "She is not a member of this congregation. She was not on the guest list for the wedding. She was not invited. What she did was a willful act of cruelty performed in this sanctuary, and I want to say that directly to you. It was wrong, it was not her place, and whatever she hoped to accomplish, she accomplished nothing except confirming that the decision you made that morning was the right one." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Pastor, I need to ask you something directly. I need to know if I can still be here, in this church, as myself, not as the woman whose wedding fell apart, not as the cautionary tale or the subject of whispered conversations. I need to know if there is space for me to rebuild inside this community, without that story being the only thing this community sees when they look at me." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Simone, you walked those 4 pews in a wedding dress in front of 400 people, and you told a woman to leave the house of God with more dignity than most people could find in the best circumstances of their lives. The people of this congregation did not watch a woman fall apart. They watched a woman stand up. That is what they saw. That is what they will see when they look at you. I went home from that meeting, and I sat in my living room for a long time, and I thought about what it meant to be seen correctly. To have the defining moment of a terrible day be not the terrible thing that happened, but the way you handled it. To have your community hold the truer version of your story when you are too close to the pain to hold it yourself. I thought about Grandma Opal's hands on my face. Whatever happens today, remember that God never wastes a moment. Lord, I am 3 weeks out from the worst day of my life, and I am still standing. Some days standing is all I can manage, and I am learning to let that be enough. I am making lists and going to therapy and eating food and calling my sister and sitting in your word for longer than feels comfortable because the comfortable places are all occupied by grief right now. I am asking you to show me the next step, not the whole plan. I have learned not to ask for the whole plan. Just the next step, just what is required of me in this season. Show me what this broken thing is supposed to become. Because you said you do not waste moments, and I am going to hold you to that. The next step, when it arrived, was not dramatic. It arrived in the form of a phone call from Dr. Kezia Brandt, who had been my therapist and who also, I knew, occasionally did consulting work with churches and faith communities on mental health programming. She called on a Thursday afternoon, about 2 months after the wedding. She said, "Simone, I want to ask you something and I want you to think about it before you answer." The director of the Women's Counseling Program at Bright Morning Star reached out to me because they are looking to expand their professional mental health support for women in crisis situations. Divorce, domestic situations, grief, trauma. They want a licensed clinician who understands the faith context. I thought of you immediately, but I wanted to ask you before I mentioned your name. I was quiet for a moment. She said, "You don't have to answer today." I said, "I don't need to wait." "Yes, you can mention my name." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure? Because the exposure, the fact that people in that congregation know your situation." I said, "Kezia, the women I would be working with are women in crisis. They are not looking for someone who has never been hurt. They are looking for someone who knows what hurt looks like from the inside and found a way through. That is not a liability in this context. That is the qualification." She said, "That is the right answer." Within 3 weeks, I had a meeting with the women's ministry director, Sister Claudette, a woman of 61 who had been running Bright Morning Star's women's ministry for 11 years, with the efficiency and warmth of someone who had been trained by both experience and the Holy Spirit. She had done her research. She knew my credentials. She had reviewed my practice. She understood what I was offering. We sat in her office for 2 hours and talked about what a formalized mental health support component in the women's ministry would look like, what boundaries needed to be maintained between pastoral care and clinical care, how to create a structure that served women without overwhelming them. She said at the end of that meeting, "Simone, can I tell you something honestly?" I said, "Please." She said, "When I first heard about what happened at your wedding, my first thought, and I am confessing this because I think you should know, was, that poor woman. And my second thought, about 30 seconds later, was, that is a woman who just showed every woman in this congregation exactly what it looks like to choose yourself in the hardest possible moment. And my third thought was, this church needs that woman in a formal capacity." She looked at me steadily. "So I am glad we are here." I started the Women's Mental Health Support Program at Bright Morning Star 4 months after the wedding. I ran it as a part-time consulting arrangement alongside my private practice, 2 evenings per week in a dedicated space in the education wing, with clear professional boundaries, a formal intake process, and coordination protocols with the pastoral care team. The program offered individual sessions on a sliding fee scale, a weekly women's support group, and quarterly workshops on topics that I selected based on what I was seeing in the sessions. Financial wellness after relationship dissolution, rebuilding identity after loss, navigating faith and mental health simultaneously. The first month, I saw 7 women. The second month, 14. By the 6th month, I had a waiting list, and Sister Claudette and I were having conversations about expanding the program to include a second clinician. I want to tell you about one woman I saw in that program, not with identifying details, but with the essential truth of the encounter, because it represents what I most need you to understand about what the pain became. She was 47 years old. She had been married for 19 years and had discovered 3 months earlier that her husband had been leading a parallel life. A second relationship, a significant financial deception, years of managed reality that had left her with a fractured sense of her own perception. She was not sure, she told me in our second session, that she trusted herself anymore. She was not sure her judgment was reliable. She was not sure she knew what real was. I looked at her and I said, "Your judgment is not what failed. His honesty is what failed. Those are not the same thing." She looked at me. She said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Because I have sat where you are sitting, and I know that the woman who was deceived is not the same woman as the woman whose discernment is faulty. You were given false information by someone you trusted. That is his failure. Your job now is not to punish your own judgment. It is to learn how to rebuild trust in yourself by starting with the truth of what you know, not the version of reality he constructed." She cried, and in her crying, I heard something I recognized, not just pain, but the beginning of a door opening, the beginning of a woman starting to claim the version of events that was true rather than the one that had been constructed for her convenience of someone else. I thought about the woman in white in the 4th pew. I thought about the moment I had turned and walked back and stood in front of her and said what needed to be said. I thought about the 400 people who had watched me do it. I thought about what it had cost me and what it had given me, and what God had been building out of it since. And I understood something I had not fully understood before. The worst moment of my life had made me specifically, practically, irreplaceably useful to women who needed someone who had stood in the fire and come out carrying something other than ash. That is not nothing. That is everything. I want to tell you about the financial rebuilding, because this story is not complete without it, and because the women I work with need to hear it in the specific, practical terms that make it actionable rather than just inspiring. My private practice had been open for 2 years when the wedding happened. I had 12 regular clients and a steady referral stream from 2 primary care physicians in my network. It was not yet the practice I wanted it to be. It was a promising beginning that I had been building carefully, and that the months leading up to the wedding had, honestly, occupied a portion of my attention that should have been on the business. After the wedding, I put that attention back where it belonged. I hired a business consultant, a Black woman named Iris, who specialized in healthcare private practices, to do a full assessment of where I was and where I could be in 24 months. Iris was direct in the way that people are direct when they respect you enough not to manage your feelings. She told me that my pricing was below market, that my marketing was minimal and passive, that I had 2 specializations, trauma and relationship betrayal, that were significantly underrepresented in the Atlanta therapy landscape, and that if I was willing to invest in building out a proper digital presence and a referral network, I could double my practice within 18 months. I was willing. I raised my rates to market rate. I built a website with clear language about my specializations. I started a professional newsletter for referring providers. I hired a part-time administrative assistant, a recent graduate named Jordan, who was organized and reliable, and who freed me to see more clients by handling the administrative infrastructure I had been managing myself at the cost of clinical hours. Within 12 months, my practice had grown from 12 clients to 28, with a waiting list. Within 18 months, I was bringing in an income that allowed me, for the first time in my adult life, to fully fund my retirement account, maintain an emergency fund at 6 months of expenses, and begin saving for the ownership of my own office space rather than renting. I moved into my own office, a suite in a building 12 minutes from Bright Morning Star, on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months after the wedding that did not happen. I stood in that empty suite with the keys in my hand, and I thought about the list I had made in those first terrible weeks. The financial unwinding, the deposits lost, the furniture in storage, the trip that never happened. I thought about going through that list line by line. Survivable, survivable, survivable. And I thought about what survival had built. I said thank you out loud, to God and to myself, because both needed to be thanked. God had not wasted the moment, and I had not wasted the survival. Marcus left Bright Morning Star 8 months after the wedding. I heard this from Sister Marilyn, who told me with the careful neutrality of a woman who knew this was information I needed, and not gossip. He and Tanya had ended, apparently, in the weeks after the wedding. Whatever she had come to that sanctuary expecting to happen had not happened, which was its own form of accounting that I did not need to witness. He had gone through the church's accountability process. He had, by the report of those who knew, been genuinely reckoned with in the way that people are reckoned with when they are made to face what they have done in a structured and documented way. I did not celebrate his departure. I did not mourn it. I had worked hard in therapy and in prayer to release Marcus from the central position in my interior life that his betrayal had briefly forced him into, and that work had largely succeeded. He occupied, by the time he left, approximately the space in my life that he deserved to occupy, which was the space of someone who had been in my life and had chosen to be dishonest and had faced the consequences of that choice. Not enormous. Not nothing, appropriately sized. Tanya I did not see again. I heard, through the kind of informal network that large city black church communities maintain, that she had moved to another congregation on the other side of Atlanta. I prayed for her once, formally and deliberately, because I had decided that the carrying of hatred toward her was a weight I was not willing to bear, and that prayer was the most efficient way I knew to set it down. I did not pray for her return to my life. I prayed for her healing, whatever that looked like, in the direction of whoever she was trying to become. And then I released it. The releasing was not instant. It was a daily practice for about 4 months. And then one morning I woke up and realized I had not thought about Tanya in 2 weeks. And I understood that the releasing had become complete without my noticing the exact moment it finished. That is how most healing works, I have learned. Not with a dramatic arrival of peace, but with the quiet discovery that the thing you were carrying is no longer in your hands. About a year after the wedding, I was sitting in a women's support group session at Bright Morning Star. A room with 8 women, some I had known for years, and some I had met through the program, all of them at various stages of navigating the specific losses that bring women to a room like this. And a woman I had been seeing for 3 months said something that has stayed with me since. She was 51 years old. She had been betrayed by both a husband and a business partner in the same year. And she had spent the first months of our work together in the particular paralysis of a person who has been struck from so many directions that she no longer knows which way is forward. She had been making progress, real, earned, not performed progress. And on this particular evening, she said something that stopped the room. She said, "I used to pray for God to save my marriage. And when he didn't, I thought he wasn't listening. But now I wonder if he was listening so well that he answered a prayer I didn't know I was praying. The prayer I was too afraid to say out loud, the one that went, 'God, please don't let me spend my life in a lie.'" The room was quiet for a long moment. I looked at this woman who had come into my office 3 months ago, barely able to speak in complete sentences, and I saw a woman who had found the language for what God had done in her specific, painful, unrequested circumstances. And I thought about a June morning and gold light through a bridal suite window and my grandmother's hands on my face. Whatever happens today, remember that God never wastes a moment. Not one. I had laughed. Because it was my wedding morning and everything was beautiful. And Grandma Opal had known, had felt in the specific way that old women of faith feel things, that the moment was going to require more of me than a wedding morning should require. And she had given me the only thing that would be enough for what was coming. Not a warning, not a preparation, a theology. God never wastes a moment. I had needed a theology that day. Not an explanation, not a prediction. A framework large enough to hold what was about to happen without crushing me under the weight of it. And she had given it to me, in both her hands, with her eyes holding mine. I excused myself briefly from the support group that evening, just for 2 minutes, and I stood in the hallway outside the room and I called Grandma Opal. She was 80 years old now, and she answered on the 4th ring in the slightly breathless way she answered phones since her hip surgery. And I said, "Grandma, I just needed to tell you that I understand now what you said on my wedding morning." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, I wondered when you'd call to tell me that." I laughed. And this time, the laugh was different. Not the bright, uncomplicated laugh of a woman standing in the sunlight before the storm. This laugh had weather in it. It had 3 years of survival and rebuilding and women sitting in a circle and keys to a new office and a practice that was mine and a faith that had been tested until it was something other than comfortable and therefore something other than fragile. This laugh had earned itself. 2 years after the wedding that did not happen, Pastor Green asked me to speak at the Women's Ministry annual banquet. He asked me without preamble, without ceremony, in the hallway after a Sunday service. "Simone, will you be the keynote this year? I think the women need to hear from you." I said yes before I fully considered what that meant. Then I went home and considered what it meant. It meant standing in front of the women of Bright Morning Star Baptist Church, some of whom had been in that sanctuary on that June morning, some of whom had heard the story secondhand, some of whom had sat in my support group and trusted me with their own stories, and telling the truth about what had happened and what it had cost and what it had built. It meant being seen as fully as I had been asking the women in my practice to allow themselves to be seen. It meant doing the thing I had been teaching that was harder than anything. I prepared for 3 weeks, not the speech. The speech came in one morning, 4 a.m., pouring out of me the way things pour out when they have been waiting long enough. What I prepared was myself. I went to therapy. I went to prayer. I called Vanessa and talked for 2 hours. I called Grandma Opal, and she said, as she always does when I am about to do something difficult, "Baby, tell the truth. The truth is the only thing that feeds people." The night of the banquet, the fellowship hall was full. 140 women of various ages, dressed in their best, with the particular energy of women who have gathered to be in a room together and mean it. The food was good. The worship was good. And then I stood at the microphone. I told them everything. I told them about the wedding morning and the gold light and my grandmother's hands. I told them about the woman in white in the 4th pew. I told them about walking those 4 pews and saying what I said and the decision I made at the altar. I told them about the grief and the anger and the 2 a.m. mornings and the list I made and the therapy and the practice I built. I told them about the first client who sat across from me and said she didn't trust her own judgment anymore, and what I had said to her and why I knew it was true. I told them about Grandma Opal on the phone saying, "Baby, I wondered when you'd call to tell me that," and the laugh that had weather in it. And I said, at the end, this: the worst moment of my life happened in the house of God, and the best thing I have ever built grew out of that moment in the house of God. I do not know what you came here carrying tonight. I do not know what Wednesday morning looks like in your house, or what your marriage is holding, or what you are afraid to say out loud to the people who love you. But I want you to hear this. The betrayal that is trying to define you is not the definition. You are the definition. The version of you that stands up when everything falls down, that woman is the real story. Trust her. She knows the way. The room was quiet. And then it was not quiet. And I stood at the microphone and I received what the room gave me, the specific, communal, irreplaceable gift of a group of women who recognized themselves in what I had said. And I felt Grandma Opal's theology holding the whole moment up. God never wastes a moment. Not the wedding morning, not the 4 pews, not the woman in white, not the grief, not one. Today, I am 41 years old. My practice has its own suite, its own staff of 3, and a referral network that has grown beyond anything Iris projected in that first business assessment. The Women's Mental Health Program at Bright Morning Star is in its 3rd year and has served over 200 women. I am developing a curriculum for training other faith-based organizations in mental health-informed pastoral care. a project that has taken me back to school part-time for additional credentialing, and that I expect to complete in the next 18 months. I am not married. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this one sometimes imply that the triumph must eventually include a better love story, and I do not want to offer you a false comfort. I have dated. I have been careful in the ways that women who have been deceived learn to be careful, and also in the ways that Dr. Brandt helped me learn to be careful without becoming sealed, because careful and sealed are not the same thing. And I will not let what Marcus did turn me into a woman who cannot trust. I am still learning the wiser kind of trust that Dr. Brandt talked about, the trust that has passed through fire and come out stronger than the naive kind. I am not closed, I am careful. Those are different. What I am, on this side of everything that happened, is more fully myself than I have ever been. More clear about what I am worth and what I will not accept and what I am here to build. More rooted in the faith that proved itself in the worst circumstances, not the faith that gave me good circumstances, but the faith that held me in bad ones. More certain than I have ever been that the calling on my life is specific and real, and mine, and that no person and no betrayal has the authority to revoke it. My grandmother Opal is 80 years old, and she is still in her armchair in Memphis, in her silver dress and her white gloves, still prophesying in the particular way of old women who have been listening to God long enough that the listening and the speaking have become indistinguishable. I call her every week. Sometimes I call her just to hear her say baby the way she says it, like the word is a whole theology, like it contains everything she has ever believed about who I am and what I am capable of, and what God has planned for me that I cannot yet see. She says it, and I believe it, and I keep building. A reflection for the woman who is still deciding whether to stand up. The dress may still be on your body. The flowers may still be on the pews. The life you planned may look like wreckage from where you are standing. And every part of you wants to know why God let you walk this far into something that was going to break. I will tell you what I know. He did not let you walk into it to destroy you. He let you walk into it because he knew what you would do when the truth arrived. He knew you would stand. He knew the standing would be the thing that shaped everything that came after. The practice, the women in the circle, the curriculum, the version of yourself you have not yet met, but who is already being built out of exactly this material. Romans 5:3 does not say we should pretend suffering is fine. It says we glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces patience, and patience produces character, and character produces hope. The process is real. The tribulation is real. The patience it requires is the hardest thing you will ever practice, and the character it produces, the woman who knows what she is worth because she has been tested at the exact point of her value. That woman is the hope. You are the hope, not despite what happened to you, because of what you chose to do in the moment it happened. Stand up, walk those 4 pews. Say what must be said, and then turn back toward the altar of your own life and begin the ceremony that was always meant for you. God does not waste moments, not even this one, especially not this one. If this story reached into a place you recognize, if you have ever stood in the ruins of something you built with your whole heart and had to decide what to do next, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me how you stood. Tell me what you built after. This circle is for women who tell the truth about real things. Like this video if it stayed with you. It helps more women find it who need to hear that standing is possible. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we gather here, and every week we choose the truth, and every week we remind each other that the worst moment is never the last word. We are here. We are not going anywhere, and neither are you.